Alright, so we're going to go through this pretty fast. This is America and World War I. Some of the stuff we've already talked about, some of the stuff is going to be new. You're going to have a quiz over this, open note, timed quiz, so you're going to want to have most of the text from the screen on your notes. It's going to be up to you what you put down, but you'll be able to use whatever you put down on the test. You'll have to pause this in some places because I'll probably be going too fast for you to take notes. That's perfectly fine. Just you'll be able to pause and put down what's on the slide. So we're going to look at, from the Americans' perspective, we're going to look at the causes. We're going to look at why did we become involved and what were the consequences of World War I for us and for the world. So I'm not going to talk about these. We already talked about the causes as far as the main. This is a little bit different order: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. If you don't have a good set of notes from this the other day from the video, you may want to pause this and take notes. If you have this down from the other day, then you can just use that part of your notes or use the other document when you take your quiz. We said yesterday with our simulation, we gave these countries fake names, but we sort of figured out who they were in each class. So on one side, the main combatants would be France, Britain, and Russia, and that's called the Triple Entente. And the Triple Alliance, the other side would be Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So if you look, the Central Powers are in the middle of Europe, so that's why they're called Central. And the Triple Entente is on both sides. So just like during World War II, Germany is going to fight on two fronts. They're going to fight against the Russians on one side, the French and the British on the other. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were not as significant militarily, obviously, as what Germany was, but based on the numbers that we were looking at yesterday, Germany had by far the best military. Britain had by far the best navy. Italy is really the only significant difference between World War I and World War II as far as geography. Italy joins Germany in World War II, but World War I they're on the side of the Allies. So we said yesterday that basically Europe was complicated and there was probably no way to avoid conflict. With the simulation, you guys figured out there was no way to get around this fighting. But we did say the one thing that sparks this war, which really could have been anything. If it wouldn't have been this, it probably would have been something else. It was sort of sooner or later this was going to happen. But Franz Ferdinand is going to be killed. He's the heir to the Austria-Hungarian throne, and he's going to be killed by a Serbian nationalist who wants independence for his country and doesn't trust the Austrian-Hungarians. And that guy's name is right there. And those two names you're going to kind of want to know. You're going to not need to worry about the YouTube videos because I'm not going to give them to you. But make sure you have those names and understand this is the one event that sparks World War I, but the underlying causes were more complicated. So for the U.S., there's a couple of big publicity things that are going on. I'm going to give you some more detail about that in a different video. But the Germans in 1917 resume unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans can't compete with the British above the water. Their navy isn't able to do that, but they're able to compete with the British below the water. So their submarines, the German submarines, are basically, at the beginning of the war, they're going to shoot stuff, anything that's supplying the British. They're going to take a 2-year break, and then they're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. Part of that is basically letting everybody know if you're going to Britain, we think that we're at war with them and it's okay that we shoot you. So if it's a passenger ship, it doesn't matter. The one that gets most of the press, and there were definitely other ones, is the sinking of the Lusitania. 1,200 people were on board, including 128 Americans, and American propaganda and British propaganda made that look like an unprovoked attack, even though Americans and British citizens in the government knew that this was a risk that they take by getting on these boats, and Lusitania was also carrying a bunch of weapons bound for Britain. The second big thing that textbooks only cite as our reason why we get involved in the war is the Zimmerman note, and that was a telegram from the German ambassador to Mexico, and it was the idea that the Germans were trying to form sort of a secret alliance with the Mexicans, that if we were to enter the war, that Mexico would start fighting against us and Germany would support them. The British are going to intercept that and make it public, and it's going to make the American people extremely angry with the Germans, and it's going to tip public opinion away from the Germans toward the British, so it's used as a form of propaganda to make it, the war, entering the war, more popular. Term you need to have in the back of your head, and we're not going to talk about it too much today, but convoy system was how the British were moving things back and forth. To deal with the U-boats, they would get large groups of boats together to protect the merchant ships carrying the things, same way that we kind of talked about in World War II. For us, our troops are going to be 3 million. The Army is going to be formed using the Selective Service Act once we declare war, which is the draft. Same thing we did in World War II, except for we wait till we're at war to have a draft instead of like at World War II when we had a peacetime draft. Our troops are going to be known as the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF, and the commanding general is going to be John J. Pershing. We don't get involved in the war till 1917, so 1914, 1915, 1916, we aren't over there. It's not till 1917, the year before the war is over, much like World War II, that we get involved. 3 terms that you need to know, that just in case I don't think I covered all these somewhere, so I want you to make sure that you have these in your head. You may get a question on these on your quiz. Conscientious objector, the person who opposes the war on moral grounds. Pacifist, opposes all wars altogether, it doesn't matter what war. Immobilization is the process of a country preparing for war. Things about World War I. That characterize the Western Front, which is where we fight. The Western Front is the fighting between the British, French, and the Germany on the west side of Europe. Eastern Front may be a little bit different, but we're not going to talk about that so much. But the Western Front and the Eastern Front, to some extent, basically bogs down. At first, Germany advances quickly, but then they get stuck in France, and it's going to turn into basically permanent fighting positions. So when you're stuck in one place, you need to be covered. Soldiers don't want to just sit there and get shot at, so they start digging trenches. We'd use trenches in Civil War. Trenches have been around for a long time. The difference in World War I, I guess, is the trenches become almost permanent. So for 2 and 3 years, in some cases, nobody advances or doesn't advance very much. So these trenches become dug in. It becomes known as trench warfare. Some of these things are going to be 10 foot deep, with basically permanent trenches that people live in. So a little different than just digging a foxhole for cover. So the space between the trenches, you'll see in a couple pictures in a second, it's called no man's land. Extremely dangerous. Both sides, these trenches could be anywhere from 100 to 600-700 feet apart, sometimes more. But both sides have machine guns and artillery aimed at the other side's trench, and if you're in between those, you're basically, target practice. So no man's land is the ground in between. Trench warfare is the system of this, and we talked about U-boats or German submarines, which were often used against merchant or civilian ships that were carrying weapons. Pictures of the trenches, they originally start out kind of, small enough to hide, and, and then as people stay in one place, they start getting deeper. They would often fight by jumping out of the trenches and running across at the other guys who had artillery and machine guns. So an assault would be everybody jump out of your trench and run towards the other side. Sort of like what you would have saw in the Civil War, except for instead of walking in lines, they're running across. Those were usually bad. You usually died if you had to participate in those. It didn't work very well. So you can see kind of the advancement of the trenches. They're starting to get bigger, deeper, but you can also see barbed wire starting to form. So each side would put barbed wire in front of their trench. So if you were going to assault another trench, you had to go through barbed wire on top of that. They would set up machine gun posts on each side to defend their trenches. And this is a good picture of no man's land. So you take what used to be a forest, and from all the artillery shells and the bombing and fighting, basically you're left with a bunch of stumps. And that would be what you would have to try and run across to get to the other trench to assault the people. And if obviously the people you're running at are in a trench, you can't really shoot at them while you're running at them. You have to basically get there before you could really do any damage. If you look, the trenches become permanent. This is a pretty good example of what that would look like. So they're deep. They have ridges cut in them. There's sometimes boards on the ground. You're going to look at what life is like in the trenches in a different video, but that's kind of an example of what a permanent trench would have looked like. War technology. We talked about how planes really weren't that useful as far as basically just reconnaissance. Most of the time the planes would be fighting each other. So if you heard like the Red Baron from like the Snoopy story, Red Baron was a guy that had a red plane, and he stood out. Everybody know who he was. He was a German ace or excellent pilot, and he eventually ends up being shot down by he's fighting like 3 planes at once. But planes didn't make that much of a difference. Machine guns and grenades were difference makers. Machine guns were used, you see picture there, in new ways, and they're more effective than they used to be. Tanks were just invented. They were kind of clumsy and didn't do that much good. Grenades were invented. There's chemical weapons that were used, mustard gas, things like that, first by the French, but mostly by the Germans later. Flamethrowers were invented and pretty successful. So a lot of the weapons we saw in World War II were field tested or developed or kind of refined from World War I. Cost of the war, 22 million dead, 20 million wounded, 100 million refugees, $338 billion. Now, if you look at that's the cost for everyone, we are such a small piece. We don't get there till the end. We get there after the Russians surrender, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. About 48,000 Americans are killed in battle, 62,000 by disease, and 200,000 wounded. So when you look at that compared to the whole thing, you see why we weren't that significant of a piece overall in the whole war. Home front looks almost identical in some ways to what we had for World War II. We have a War Industries Board that committee that sets up efficient production, controls things. We sell war bonds. Committee on Public Information controls propaganda. The Espionage and Sedition Act is going to mean that you could say anything disloyal and that you could be punished for that. We're going to promote food rationing. We're going to have the National War Labor Board, which we talked about in World War II. We're going to have a migration of people from the south to the north to work in the factories. Very similar things. Make sure you take notes on those pieces. You're going to want to pause this and do that. One of the things that we don't talk about enough, probably World War I, is that Russia gets out of the war in 1917 because of the Communist Revolution. So Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik Revolution is what we're going to call it. This is Russia turning to communist. And when they do that in 1917, they drop out of the war. So Germany is able to take all their effort and stop fighting Russia and turn it around and start fighting the French and the British, which is why it becomes really important that the Americans show up, because the British are going to win if... the Germans are going to win if nothing happens, or at least they have a better shot, because now they can put all their energy into one front, just the Western Front, instead of the Eastern and Western Front. Peace treaty or armistice, we talked about this on November 11th. So no, 11 a.m., November 11th, so the 11th month, the 11th day at 11 a.m. 1918 was the ceasefire. This is what we call Veterans Day, and this was supposed to be the war that ends all war, so this was supposed to be the end of fighting in Europe. And a couple of just pictures from the newspapers of that time. The peace process is going to be known as the Treaty of Versailles. President Wilson is going to give a speech called the 14-point speech. You don't necessarily need to put anything but the first 5 points down right now, because we'll talk about it more in detail. But his goal was very ideological. He wanted to avoid war in the future. So make sure you put those first 5 things: no secret treaties, freedom of the seas, tariffs and economic barriers should be removed. Arms should be reduced to the lowest amount possible, and the colonial powers should consider the interest of colonists as well as their own interest, and also the League of Nations. So just pause it, put those in there, and we'll talk about those in more detail. Treaty of Versailles, peace treaty, establishes 9 new nations, gets rid of the Ottoman Empire, gets rid of Austria-Hungary, barred Germany from maintaining an army, fined Germany, and made Germany admit to the sole responsibility of starting World War I. And that's what's going to lead the Germans to World War II. So pause this, put those notes down there. That's what you guys need to have for tomorrow. So make sure you have what you need for your notes as far as the open note quiz tomorrow.